Okay, everyone, we are back for another episode of Expected by Whom. We are happily to be joined today by Agent Al Roy comes in and joins us today. I know it was as we were getting going here, we were dealing with Wi-Fi issues on all three fronts, so we're going to try to keep everything as smooth as possible, but hockey conversation be good as long as the technicalities keep us going. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Kind of just wanted to start off right out. Right now I'm got Wings training camp kind of going in a room behind me. I found like a little small room in the bowels of Little Caesars Arena to record this in while I'm waiting. For you, as an agent, September 26th, just kind of, so I wanted to start right there. What is this time of year typically like for you? Is it finally the quiet time, or is it your work is, not that your work is done, but is it kind of now you wait and see? What's this like for you and someone in your world?
Yeah, the sad part is the sliver of quiet time that we sometimes get if you don't have a camp holdout is right before camp, right before rookie camp. I'd say like the last week or two of August and the first week of September. Then it's pure mayhem again because you got the rookie tournament starting. They're all over the place. My suggestion would be that the league does a Eastern Conference rookie tournament and a Western Conference rookie tournament, and we can all be there because having them, in 5-6 different places, it's tough as an agency. You got to split up and get everybody everywhere. And then today, waking up to some text that hey, just got cut last night. You get a minute to talk. Somebody got banged up, minor injury. Guys haven't paid for the disability insurance. Got to remind them to do that. There's a lot of different stuff going on, on the contract side, there's always some pending possible extensions, and then you have some entry level guys who have made it this far in the camp that teams are considering signing. So it's a little bit of a mishmash of everything today, but it's not a heavy dosage day. It's like somewhere in the middle.
Well, that's part of what makes it so exciting to have you on the show today, because just in that opening answer, you provided 3 different things you're having a player do or having to do that aren't related to just signing a contract. And so one of the things I was hoping you could shed some light on is just one, when you're looking as an agency for a particular player or opportunity to represent a player, kind of how does the agency go about doing that? And then the second thing is like, what does a typical agency do in terms of providing services for a player? Obviously, everyone focuses in on the contract, but there's a whole host of other things that an agency is doing to represent a player. And so I was hoping you would be able to shed a little bit of light on that for us today.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously not just myself in the company. On the hockey side, there are 12 staff members that do anything from admin work to we have a marketing only person. We have and then we have strategically located agents and scouts throughout North America, and then we have partners in every European country. So we have the whole hockey world covered there. And on top of that, about 2 years ago, I basically set up a partnership with a large family office out of Minnesota called North Rock Partners, and they are the arm that does everything non-hockey. So they have a platform called NRX Hockey, and they use this platform to provide advice on pretty much everything financial and plus to hockey professionals. So it's an interesting world because we start very early. That part I'm not crazy about, but it's where the industry's gone. If a player is 13 or 14 years old, we identify them, and we speak mainly with parents because being at that age, they're probably not going to be able to make a decision themselves, and wouldn't suggest it either way. I was 13 or 14 at some point, so how many bad decisions I would have made. But it's really changed the game. It went from, I've been doing this. This will be my 25th season doing this. So, in the beginning, I think 16, 17 was kind of like once guys had played a year of junior, you really kind of started kind of putting pressure on, pick an agent, and we started thinking about pro. Now you get the 14-year-old draft in the West. You've got the academy programs all over North America that are kind of vying for the talented kids. Parents have to make decisions earlier. It's what's driving the process, So when kids are 12, 13, 14, they're having these conversations, and they want somebody to talk to about the information and how to process it. So the good part is you have some good people that do what we do, that have good intentions, and you're trying to help people make good decisions. And you got people who are driven by the wrong motivations in this business, and that part's always a concern.
It was always like, it had already naturally been a bit of the Wild West of this, right? And I'm curious, has it kind of been pushed further even more with some of this recent college stuff too? Where like it used to be, if someone was going the college route, like there was some limitations on what they could do, and that seems to be opening up. Like, is it one of those where it's like, this has already been happening for years, where it's been getting younger and younger? Is it something where that just kind of took off any final stopgap of anything?
Yeah, I think what's happening with the NCAA definitely is muddying the waters a lot. You're hearing a lot of CHL programs throw the NCAA out there now as a recruiting tool, saying, "Hey, well, you can come here and still go to college, right?" So who would have ever thought that you would hear that? And that's not done yet. I know that lawsuit was filed with the player with ASU, who was trying to get to ASU. I still think we're probably a year to 2 years away from any resolution there. But it is a recruiting war. I feel bad for the parents and the kids, because there's a recruiting war going on the hockey side, and it's always either academy, major, junior, college. And then on the agency side, you probably have 6 to 10 major agencies vying for kids. So they're fielding phone calls left and right, and I get why they get to the point where they just want to pick somebody, because you had a 13, 14-year-old, you got other stuff to do than just field phone calls from people who are telling you that they're going to be the best thing for your kid, right? So that part is very much the Wild West, like you mentioned. It's messy, and the NIL, NCAA just adds another layer to it. I think the NCAA is probably so focused on NIL money and this labor lawsuit that's probably the primary focus at the moment, just to try to figure that out before they can move forward. I expect that things are going to change a lot. There's a lot of money being thrown around at college athletes right now, and there's not the regulation on it is a little bit all over the place. And I'm sure if you ask some schools, there's probably still some confusion, right? Because you talk about NIL money, and some schools will tell you, the state is going to help control this, or the school itself. But it seems to be like a free-for-all at the moment, which is concerning. Yeah.
So, you're representing these players now starting earlier and earlier, 13 and 14 years of age, kind of sticking with them all the way through, the draft. They get to the league, they make their team out of training camp. You're negotiating the contracts. Would you be able to give just like a high-level overview of kind of what the contract negotiation process looks like in terms of, player input, saying, and for the purposes of this, we won't talk about an entry level. We'll talk about like either a restricted free agent renegotiating or, an SPC, in this case, standard player contract. But, a player wants to come in and say, this is what they're thinking. The GM obviously has their input. You have your input as the agent. Would you be able to just give us a high-level overview of what the contract negotiation process looks like for these standard player contracts?
Sure. Obviously the system works, I'll explain the system before we get into it, which is, it's either 7 years in the league or you're 27 years old before you become a UFA, to simplify things. So you're what's called a restricted free agent for many years. And based on a chart of service, you either get arb rights or you don't. And arbitration rights are very important for players, because that's really when the leverage can start on the negotiation. And when young players get to the NHL and they get through their entry-level contract, and all of a sudden they're through it, unless they've played significant games in the NHL, you will see situations like you saw in New Jersey with, okay, look at his name, from Newfoundland. I'm blanking here. Mercer, Dawson Mercer, right? Where because there are no arb rights, and the only way that you can kind of get what you want is to hold out, you're going to get some of those. Or you will get a lot of teams that say, okay, we're going to bet on this player and on us winning this bet and being on the top side of this deal. They will offer a long-term deal to a player coming out of his entry-level contract that doesn't have arb rights. But even when you do those kind of deals, you really try to break it down on a year by year. So let's say you're talking about a 6 or 7 year or 8 year contract. Both sides really break it down as to the true value year, meaning that you look at the RFA years, what you think they're going to be worth. Then you look at the UFA years and what you think the player is going to project to be. And like every negotiation, we're going to be on the high side, and the team will find some comparables on the low side. I don't know what other agencies do, but we have an advanced stats staff that basically does the deep research on not just the comparables, but advanced stats. We're actually working on an AI product right now that I think is going to be revolutionary. That's going to bring some different dimensions. And I guess my biggest complaint in the hockey world is we are slow to adapt. We have a history of moving very slowly, and whether that's contract negotiations or marketing concepts, compared to the other leagues, we're not quick adapters. So sometimes as an agent, you can come in with something new, something that probably sheds a deeper light onto your player. But if the other side won't engage in that conversation, what you've come up with is not worth that much in negotiations. They just refuse to look at it, right? So it's an interesting world. But at the end of the day, you have smart people on both sides of it. It's not rocket science. You find your comparables, you fight your fight, but the ultimate driver of the bus is the player. And I think sometimes you'll see some deals come out. You're like, oh, why did that guy take that? Or why did the team give the player that, right? And there's probably some nuances behind it, whether the player didn't want to move, or he loves the coach, or the team felt that they're going to lose somebody else, or there's a pending injury that hasn't been announced yet. Like stuff like that always plays a role in a negotiation, where it comes out later why a certain deal was signed.
With players too, it's one of the things that I've had the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten the line from a player where I ask them about anything business related, and their go-to line, and I'm sure you as an agent love it that they use this, is I have an agent for that. Players are very good at using that line. In reality, though, does it come down to, is it more of, in general, obviously I know every client's going to be a little bit different, but in general, is it more so of a client says, hey, these are my goals, just come back to me with offers and let me know? Or is it more so or is the typical client a little bit more involved of the nitty-gritty back and forth? What's kind of the typical client for you when you are negotiating something with, and you're going back and forth with the GM, things like that?
Yeah, it's really driven by the client personality, and there's a wide spectrum of them, right? There's guys who are like, hey, here's what I expect, here's how many years I want, call me when it's done. And then there's guys who want to know every little step of the negotiation, and they want to look at the stats with you. And what we try to do is put together a report for our clients, share it with them, and tell them what our approach is going to be in the negotiation, so that they at least have a sense of where we think it's going to go. But like any other negotiation, if you're negotiating for a company or a player in another sport, you come up with option, the high option, the medium option, the low option. It's human nature that the player will latch on to the high option every time. So you have to be, as an agent, you have to be careful about how you set expectations, because that's usually where you end up seeing players upset with their agents or switch agents or whatever because expectations are not met. And I do have to say, for the most part, the hockey world is a very, I think most hockey players have a mirror, and they understand where they stand. Once in a while, you'll have a personality that feels differently, that feels like they're worth way more than what the market's going to bear. And as an agent, that's usually a pretty dangerous client because it's going to be very hard to live up to expectations that are not real, right? So that part I think is crucial. Just being able to speak frankly and explain where it's going to go, because if you have that trust and the player is realistic as an agent, those are the tools you need to win a negotiation. And I say win a negotiation. When you, I'm sure if you talk to a bunch of GMs, they'll tell you the same thing. Almost every deal that's comes to a resolution, both sides leave a little bit unhappy. That's usually the sign of like, okay, that's probably a fair market deal. When you both walk away, you're like, man, I wish we would have gotten 6 instead of 5.75, right? And the other side's like, hey, we got it for 5.75. We had to give an extra year or something like that. Like those are the nuances that I think the fans out there don't kind of get to see. But at the end of the day, the client drives the ship. And in 25 years, I got to say that there's sometimes like where I've done a deal where it's like, I wouldn't take that deal. You got to be like, no, don't do this. But guys want security, or sometimes their partner wants to be in that city and doesn't want to move, and we're at a crucial point where they got to make a decision, or they're going to get traded. Like that kind of stuff's always comes into play.
So you talked about managing expectations of the players, heading into these negotiations. One of the things that I've been largely curious about is we've seen the shift in landscape where these younger players that are restricted free agents, sort of as soon as the team and player kind of recognize these are going to be top of the lineup players, there's a push for getting them locked into 7-8 years as quickly as you can, kind of shifting that longer term deal timeline earlier. I'm curious, given that these are the restricted free agent pools, is there often a set of expectations going in for this is what a shorter term deal could look like, this is what a longer term deal could look like? I want your input kind of which one you sort of prefer, but then managing the expectation that you may have to go in a bucket like that? Or is it largely, like you mentioned earlier, just kind of tinkering with the dollars and trading off years to make things work?
Yeah, it's it's become a very common conversation, especially for players coming out of their entry-level deals that have been in the NHL for most of their entry-level contract. The interesting dynamic is that teams are willing to bet on some of these players with long-term deals, knowing that the cap is going to go up. But when we turn around and try to have a conversation with a lot of teams about, well, let's use percentage of cap because the cap's going up, they're like, well, no, there's no guarantee the cap's going up, right? So they're playing both sides of it, which, if I was in their seat, I'd probably do the same thing. But that is a very common view and frustrating for agents because it's like, well, come on, you just gave this guy 8 times 8 because you expect the cap to go up at least $2 million to $4 million a year for the next 4 years. But meanwhile, we're trying to use it in a negotiation for this guy, and you won't even hear us. So that part is interesting. Sometimes you've got teams who will come right out and say, "Listen, it's going to be a bridge deal. It's going to be a 2 or 3 year deal. We're not going to do 7 or 8." And then, that's always, if a player's an aspiring 7-8 year player, 7-8 year contract player, that's a frustrating, tough conversation to have. And usually when teams usually come out that way, like they'll usually kind of hold their ground. So then the player can say, okay, well, I'll just kind of wait it out. We'll hold out and see what happens at training camp, and makes for a long summer for everybody because that's just the way it works. But that's a lot of times where it goes. When those teams, make those long-term commitments, I think it's driven by a couple things. One, it's a gamble by the team, and it's not saying that all these players are good players, but it's more of they're betting on the fact that they're going to short. They're shorting the player, right? They're basically saying like he's going to outplay what we're paying him. On the player side, it's security. A lot of stuff drives that. Player loves where he's at. The money's close enough. You get another kick at the can. The other thing that's driving it is every year for the last, I'd say, 10 years, the league keeps getting younger and younger. And that drives the machine too, because if you're a player and let's say you get another kick at the can at anywhere between 26 to 29, you're probably going to sign another big contract. If you're a few years older and you're on your third contract, you're getting offered term, then all of a sudden you get to be over 31, 32. Depending on how you're producing, teams start discounting players quite a bit more. So there's that factor. To always kind of the age factor is an important one. But that's also why you'll see guys will take 7 years instead of 8 because you're betting on the market being higher, and you'll make more money in that 8th year by signing a new deal. You saw the Kachucks. They bet on themselves, right? They asked for a bridge deal, and they set that last number high. So if you're an RFA, that last year's number is important because that's a number that they're going to use to qualify you. So that kind of sets the bar for the next deal. And I mean, I like to see that. I like to see players that are confident in themselves and just want to bet on themselves and say, okay, I'll just kill it for 3 years, and that third year now they got to pay me for 8, right? And then the market will be higher. So lots of factors. Again, we exist to process the information, bring them information and comparables, but at the end of the day, the player makes the ultimate decision.
You've used the word security quite a bit. And one of the things when you look around the league right now, I can go to Puckpedia or Cap Friendly before that, and I can see which teams give out more no move clauses than others. And from a security and a player and from an agent perspective, when do those become part of the conversation? The no movement clause, the no trade clause, when guys are looking for things like that. And I'm sure it varies by organization too.
Yeah, and just to clarify. Yeah. Those become active only when the player can be a UFA, right? That first year the player can be a UFA. So they don't, because I'm sure people probably look at long-term contracts and look, why didn't he get a no-move clause in the first 4 years? Well, because he was not old enough and didn't qualify to be a UFA. It is part of a bargaining chip. When you do these deals, you'll look at term, you look at comparables, and start with AAV, but you always want to try to front load because of the time value of money. We saw a few deferred comp deals get done this summer, which is interesting. A couple interesting things this summer. That plus the offer sheets for non-star players. Those are like, to me, monumental moments. Things are going to get interesting again. I'm much older than you guys, so when I first started, we had you can negotiate performance contracts for non-entry level players, right? Which was so much more fun because then you're like, okay, well, we can't get to the number, but let's come up with some way that if he does perform, he's going to get paid. Now you get that in entry level contracts and only 35 plus contracts. So it takes all the fun out of the middle. Now the middle becomes more about, okay, well, how can I prove to you that my player is worth more than this cluster of players while you're telling me that, his value is more like this lower cluster of players. So that part excites me a little bit because when you see kind of the deferred comp coming in and the offer sheets, it makes the conversations a little more spicy.
So along those lines, I have several questions here. I'm going to try and keep it straightforward, though. The first thing that I've always been curious about, because when I went to kind of quantify the value of a no-move clause or a no-trade clause, is there, let's say you're negotiating an unrestricted free agent contract where that is starting to factor in, is there a trade-off of, okay, if you give this no-trade clause, this no-move clause, you can take $250K off, or is there essentially a monetary value to those types of clauses?
I don't know too many agents who would go and offer $250K off, but usually the team will try it, I guess. Yeah. So it's going to be like, hey, like you want this no move or no trade. Like we feel like the number's a little heavy. Can we get the AAV down? The more common move is let's add a year, especially for players in their 30s. And they can't get the number to work where, like I'm sure you guys know this, like every NHL team's got their board in the coach's office or the GM and the GM's office, with names and a dollar number attached to who's going to play 1C, 2C, 3C, 4C, right? And for them, I think it's really important to, they got to keep that in mind as they negotiate. So you'll often see teams be like, okay, well, let's give them an extra year. It's going to lower the AAV. If we got to eat it, we got to eat it. There's the possibility of LTIR. There's the possibility of a trade. There's always a possibility of a buyout. And that's why you want to make your deals top heavy. Front load that money because you just never know what's going to happen down the road. And the no trade, no move. The no move keeps you from buyout. The no trade doesn't. And players, let's face it, as players get older, they have families. They don't like moving around, and sometimes it's worth a few bucks to keep the wife happy.
You mentioned the. I got a couple things I want to go down. I want to talk offer sheets, but I want to start with just the deferred money thing because you mentioned that was obviously an interesting development this summer, and you just talked about the value of why players look at the front loaded thing, and we see more. Deferred money's been around, and I think people don't realize it's been around in hockey before. It's not that it is I remember I looked something up the other day. Even in the 90s, there was deferred money going on, but just because people didn't pay as much attention to the cap, and it's not like it was something that there weren't websites that were covering it all. So when you look at kind of the deferred money, what happened this summer, and obviously Carolina is the notable one. Where do you kind of see? Is that a trend? Is that an outlier? How do you look at kind of where that might be going for teams and players?
I don't think it's going to become like a trend. There's always a danger of a buyout, especially if that deferred money is salary and not signing bonus. The other side of the coin is I'm sure some owners who maybe think that they will not be there or will sell that team by the time they have to pay that money. It's a pretty coy move, right? Because then it's like, well, it's not going to be my problem. It's going to be somebody else's problem when they buy the team. And I would assume, if you're doing due diligence and buying a team, that would be disclosed. But still, that's probably a factor. At the end of the day, the preference is get your money up front. For anybody, you're going to defer money, in any situation, any job. Why would you do that unless there's some kind of a bonus to it, right? So that's why I don't think it's going to be a trend. I think quite a few owners are going to be like, hey, I'm going to leave. This team's going to be my family legacy. I don't think I want to do this to whoever's going to be my kids, whoever's going to take over for me. Number one, and number two, I still think getting money up front is always going to be a priority. So that one, it gives you some flexibility with the cap, just like teams have gotten smarter about LTIR. It's one of those things where I think if somebody's in a crunch and they really need to get a deal done and they got to make a number fit, that's when it's going to happen. But I don't think it's going to be all over the place.
And then the second, I guess, landmark item you identified from this offseason is the 2 offer sheets that were successfully signed and kind of transacted. And it wasn't your Sergei Fedorovs getting it. It was 2 players on restricted free agent contracts that are not necessarily considered elite players. Potentially, there's something to Dylan Holloway's game and Philip Broberg's game that's to come, but not necessarily guys that are considered marquee players. So do you think that this represents a shift? These 2, along with Jesperi Kotkaniemi, doing it with Carolina a couple years back, a shift in the way teams are viewing offer sheets and ultimately what goes into it from an agent-player conversation of, I want to sign this offer sheet, as you're going down the road there?
Yeah, I think maybe to me it's more of a philosophical shift as to management and how they view player value. And Doug Armstrong's a very smart guy. He was sure to come out as soon as those guys signed to say they had to overpay, because I know Army, he had to stamp that in the media, hey, no, those guys were not really worth that, but we had to do it. But I also, where I see the big shift philosophically is that I've always felt that teams really overvalue the value of a draft pick over a current player. And what I mean by that is you always hear when there's trade talk, it's like, yeah, we couldn't get it done. They want a second round pick. We offered a third and this player, and it's the same player, but we want a second round pick. We can't get it done. And I'm like, okay, like, why do you guys value unknown picks so much more than players who've actually played like 1 or 2 years in the league? And to me, that offer sheet move was like, okay, somebody actually kind of started to see it for what it is, which you have a semi-proven player versus a guy that you don't even know who it's going to be in a year or two that you're going to pick. Which one's worth more? Well, only the future is going to be able to tell you that. But if you're in a rebuild, like if you're, and I'm not saying that St. Louis is like in a full rebuild, but they're kind of in a rebuild. They're like in between, right? That player that you're going to sign an offer sheet to will be the guy that's going to have an effect on your team much more quickly than the guy you're going to pick with that second round pick. And I think to me, like that was like the more aha moment. Like, okay, like maybe management's going to change their style a little bit about how they view players versus picks, current players versus picks. To me, that's the most important thing. As far as like what it does to the market, well, number one, I think behind closed doors, there's probably some 4-letter words being said to each other by the GMs. Like it's kind of known in the business as like a slap in the face or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's part of the CBA, it's part of the rules. But I think there was always kind of an understanding that if you're going to do this, it's like hitting the red button on your desk, right? Like to the other team. Because you guys have seen the moments in the past. It's caused some of the most classic media moments for the hockey world. But now I'm hoping it makes it a lot more mainstream normal. I'm hoping it normalizes the offer sheet system, because before it was like almost impossible for it to happen. Now with the cap system, and some teams are up against the wall, they only have so much cap room left, and teams start looking around like, hey, like if we do this, there's no way they can match unless they trade somebody. Then you really shake up the market. And for agents, we like the market to be shaken up.
The other thing that I think people sometimes forget, and it's something that I always kind of try to point out right away, but I wanted to give you a chance to kind of wax poetically more about this, is the player actually has to sign the offer sheet. Like, so often the narrative is that, hey, this is a player, one team put it to the other team. But at the end of the day, Dylan Holloway and Broberg had to sign those deals. They could have not, like, it is, I think that's something that often gets forgotten in the narrative. It becomes this team versus team thing, but it is a player tool, too, that I think people forget.
And I don't know this per se, but I saw in the media that Holloway was waffling a little bit. Like he wasn't sure if he wanted to sign it. And like we talked about earlier, it's not always about just money, right? Like there's loyalty. There are some players who feel like, hey, this team took a chance on me. They drafted me. They helped me develop. Like I want to find a way to make it work here, which, is kind of a good story. But at the end of the day, I mean, those guys did get paid because of the offer sheets. And the offer sheet system, I don't have it in front of me, but there's basically a dollar amount that the player gets offered and then the compensation attached to that. For some of the listeners that maybe don't know how that works. And honestly, if the dollar amount's below $4 million, the compensation is not too crazy. Going back to my conversation earlier about what's the value of a pick versus a current player. And especially if you're trying to achieve something more quickly with your team, make bigger steps, then I think sometimes it's worth that gamble of saying, let's go get that player, give up those picks. Now your scouts aren't too happy because they're probably ordering pizza after the second round at the draft because you have no picks left. But that's just the way it works, right? Yeah.
All right, I'm going to close this out here with a fun question. You've been doing this about 25 years now. Are there any general managers over the history of your career that sort of stand out as you saying, all right, I know I'm going to have to, heading into this contract negotiation, going to have to ensure that I've got all the details down, I've got everything right, because it's going to be a grind. Like, were there any general managers in the history of your 25 years that you've just been saying, man, they're really going to grind here on this?
grind wise, I mean, there's the guys that have the reputation, like Lou and Brian Burke, but those guys, like honestly, one-on-one gentlemen, I think they just have like a media persona sometimes, or sometimes a persona is built by people outside the person themselves. But Lou's been nothing but a gentleman in the negotiations I've had with him. I would have to say Mike Smith, when he was in the old Winnipeg GM, good guy, but very eccentric. And you'd be having conversations, and he would go off on a tangent. You'd be like, were we just talking about a contract, or what are we talking about right now? But sometimes I think that's probably a way to negotiate, is like just be so out there, keep them off balance all the time, that they eventually are just like, all right, like we're just going to get this done. Like this is painful, right? But yeah, he was an interesting one, very interesting one. I don't know if you know Mike's history, but like he's a very interesting person. But he was definitely, and that was like in the beginning of my career, so it was even more had more of an effect on me, because I was like, okay, like I can't figure out this guy.
I have one follow up on that, just because I was thinking about this the other day. It's now obviously it's separate, right? GM and coach are not the same person. But when you came into the league, it was still the spot where GMs and coaches might have had similar jobs, right? I remember I spent a lot of time in Dallas, so I remember obviously one of the biggest stories of Ken Hitchcock getting his job wasn't Ken Hitchcock getting his job, but it was the GM deciding, I'm going to fire myself as the coach and just become just the GM. Looking back at that historically, I'm curious how that, and obviously that was much earlier in your career, but how did that change when all of a sudden it was no longer the guy who's also saying, this line, go out on the ice, and like when those things finally got separated?
I think that really started changing maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think the biggest impetus to that changing was the ownership makeup. Who were the owners, and how do they see running an NHL team? Now you got private equity firms left and right, very involved, right? It's changing negotiations where it's a lot about metrics and numbers, and the advanced stats person in the office is as important as the GM. But I do think it's, to me, that the biggest factor there was the type of owners that would come in the league. They're like, no, this is how you run a corporation. The GM does his job. You do your job, coach. And you've seen it as an agent when you talk to GMs. You're like, hey, my guy's not playing. And the answer is very often, guys, I sign the players, the coach plays them. So if you want to talk to the coach, which is an agent you almost never do, right? Because it's kind of taboo. But yeah, to me, that was probably what drove that way more than anything else, was the type of owners that came in the league.
Well, thank you so much for taking time. I was very excited for you to be able to join during, as you mentioned, this time is there's no slow time for you. So I know you probably got 15 texts from clients during this time as we were on this call. So thank you for taking the time.
I wake up at like 20 texts every morning, and I'm like, oh. Like it's 10 a.m. out east. All right, I got to get going on this.
One thing I do like to throw out to our guests sometimes before they go: is there anyone else from the hockey world, from your world, you're like, hey, Sean and Prashanth, you should get them on to explain this weird thing in the hockey world? Is there anyone that you would pop on that you think that we should be bothering to come on as a future guest?
I would say the job that's become very prominent, and they're doing it more and more, is like the player development guys are pretty interesting guys. They lead a pretty interesting life because they basically just follow the draft picks around and have to work with them. But like, I think they get forgotten in the whole process. But and I see a lot of those guys ascending rather quickly.
So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for helping us kind of shed some light on things.